Welcome, everybody. Before we start our presentation, I want you to have a look at the following images. On the left side, you can see a digitized page of the manuscript MS-DON E248, which will later be the topic of Carolin's contribution. And on the right hand, you see me turning the pages of the same manuscript. Can you spot the difference? Feel free to share your impressions in the chat or tweet them using our hashtag. As you might assume, in our work on medieval manuscripts and books, we stumbled across differences between digital and analog objects and found that we need both to gain a holistic understanding of an object. Therefore, we argue that a blended approach should be employed that integrates both the hyper-realistic images, as you can see on the left, as well as the real-life objects of use on the right, which allow you a glimpse in the original handling. In our presentation, we want to show you the benefits of going from the original to the digitized object and back, taking the use of digitized objects a step further and shining light on the general use of digitized objects. The first case study will be presented by Natascha, who is in the last year of her DPhil in Oxford, and will give you some insights on her work on the media transfer from manuscripts to printed books.
Thank you, Luise. As a first example for a blended approach, I want to offer my work with the German paper manuscript Die Heiden, Codex Palatinus Germanicus 353, which is held at Heidelberg University. Die Heiden is part of a collection of 11 works commissioned by the Duchess Margaret of Savoy from the so-called Henfling workshop between 1470 and 1477. This workshop is only directly traceable in the commissions for the Duchess, making the workshop into a fascinating case of manuscript commission in a time of print. During the initial research for my PhD, I solely consulted the digitized object. In this first phase, the visual presentation of the manuscript, such as column size and white space, as well as the artistic execution of the illustrations, were the focal point. Due to the high-quality images provided by the University of Heidelberg, the digitized object makes it easy to zoom in to determine which layers of color might have been applied first. Therefore, the even-out images of the manuscript pages offered an ideal approach. Furthermore, the downloadable images also made it easy to use tools such as Google Image Search or even Pinterest to compare them to other digitized manuscripts. It became clear in this initial step that some of the illustrations were done in a rush due to outlines left unfilled and smeared color, which hinted at a fast-paced and partialized production. My next point of interest was the context of use and the mode of use between private and presentational. For this, I needed to consult the physical object. Although the dimensions of the Heiden with 20.2 centimeters by 14.5 centimeters are clearly stated online, the numbers cannot convey the materiality and haptics of the actual object. I was slightly disappointed when I was handed a booklet of the size of a typical A5 diary during my first real-life encounter. The ability to zoom into the smallest nooks and crannies distorts our understanding of the size. Nevertheless, working with the 3D object revealed more about its possible context of use. The small format and light weight, although encompassing 70 leaves, make it easy to carry. It can be read using only one hand, making it into an ideal and mobile object of personal enjoyment. A close encounter with the materiality also confirmed my initial assessment of the quality of the materials used and the fast-paced production process. After the detailed in situ examination of the manuscript, I relied again on the digitized object to reaffirm my working theories about the Henfling workshop by switching from the micro to the macro perspective. One of the issues with the 3D object which I encountered was a perturbed leaf sequence. Due to a rebinding in 1558, the leaves were bound back incorrectly, therefore rendering the little manuscript unreadable in its 3D form. Going back to the digital object resolves this. Moreover, the different viewing modes of the restored object, in particular the side-by-side and overview function, allow me to gain insights into the working mode of the workshop, which is trying to establish a style to cater to the expectations of its noble patroness. This is evident in the overview, where a shift in style can be detected, as well as the side-by-side view of the same scene executed by different artists, which are placed on a recto and verso of the same leaf. While for other manuscripts of the Henflin workshop, an image was placed on every page, in case of the Heiden, illustrations were placed more purposefully throughout the text, which becomes evident when consulting the image overview using a bird's eye view. To summarize this, in case of the Heiden, a blended approach of going back and forth between digital and physical, reapplying newly gained information from the 2D to the 3D object, has proven insightful for my understanding and contextualization of the physical object. It has also demonstrated to me that in using the individual perspectives gained from the different media can be used to emphasize and support a working theory. With this, I want to hand back to Luise, who worked for the Old High German Dictionary and will be starting her DPhil at Oxford this September.
Thank you. The phenomenon I'm going to discuss goes back to the beginnings of the German language, to the 8th and 9th century AD. In this period, Old High German was spoken and, luckily for us, partly written. Although the main texts and manuscripts were still in Latin, some vernacular was preserved in the form of clauses. A short side note for everyone who is not familiar with the term clauses and manuscripts: the definition by the British Library is a word or words commenting on, elucidating, or translating those of the main text. Clauses were often written in the margins or between the lines. Regarding the writing technique, there were two main types of clauses: ink and stylus clauses. While ink clauses are well visible, seeing stylus clauses can be tricky. They were pressed or scratched in the parchment using styles and are usually not colored. This is why they were forgotten or ignored for a long time. But in the last years, starting with Elvira Glaser in the 90s, scholars made an effort to find stylus clauses in manuscripts. As a result, a lot of seemingly new textual material was discovered, first and foremost by Andreas Nievergelt, who is publishing a vast number of newly found Old High German stylus clauses every year. With the trend towards digitization, which allows access to manuscripts all over the world, the question arises: how are stylus clauses represented in the digitized object? At first, I want to show you a digitized page of a manuscript from 800 AD. As you might already suspect, this page contains a stylus clause. It is unlikely that someone with an untrained eye could see it. Even when you zoom in on the relevant section, it is hard to identify which scratches are intentional writing and which are just signs of wear. To see the clause, you have to change the lighting as it was made in this picture. That was kindly placed at my disposal by Andreas Nievergelt, such as the following one. To see the indentation of stylus clauses, the light has to come from a flat angle. In this way, the higher parchment casts a shadow into the scratch, and the lines of the letters, which were made with a sharp stylus, can be seen clearly. This clause, "qui breitet," translates the Latin ampliatur, which means extended. Although stylus clauses seem unhandy and hard to read to the modern reader, they were very common. One can assume that the clauses were better visible in the Middle Ages because usage and aging of the manuscripts have not affected the readability yet. Plus, punctual light sources, such as candles, are providing perfect lighting conditions to read stylus clauses, unlike the diffuse light of modern reading rooms. Here I propose a little experiment. Although no library would let you get near a manuscript with a candle, you can create your own stylus clause on thick paper, for example with a letter opener, and see how the visibility changes in candlelight, as I did in this picture. Styles were mostly used in the same way as quills. Not only marginal and interlinear clauses were written with styles, but also drawings, corrections, accent marks, and others. The best known use might be the carving of lines into the pages on which the scribes wrote. Examples of such lines can be seen in this digitized manuscript from the 9th century. Not the indentation is visible, but the loss of ink where the scratched lines are located. And again, would you find the stylus clause here? It was written with a blunt stylus and therefore not scratched but pressed into the parchment. The clause says aplagi, which means weakness. As you could see, stylus clauses often get lost during the digitization process because the lighting conditions of digitization differ from the ones that are required to make stylus clauses visible. But would it be possible to generally visualize stylus clauses in the digitized object? Depending on the position of the writer's hand and the stylus, the form of the indentation of the glosses can change, between different glosses or even between the letters of one gloss. Therefore, even stylus glosses of the same manuscript might require different lighting conditions. But the different lighting would change the appearance of the whole page, so the visibility of the remaining content of the manuscript could be affected. Uneven parchment becomes visible, and the readability of the main text might be impaired because shadows are casted. Plus, whoever is digitizing the manuscript would have to know where exactly the glosses are, and probably would have to try out which angle of light works best to show the gloss. This is almost impossible if you are not an expert in the script and the language. All in all, the way of making stylus glosses visible seems contrary to the aim of digitizing manuscripts. Although the glosses could be seen, the remaining manuscript would not be represented as a perfect and even object as it is now. And digitizing stylus glosses demands an effort that could not be made with regard to the amount of manuscripts. Thus, the role of digitization in this phenomenon should be seen differently. The digitized manuscript is a tool which can show traces of stylus glosses and pave the way to further examinations. Using a weak flashlight and experimenting with the angle of light, which still is the best way to find stylus glosses, the glosses can be made visible and photographed, and a parallel digitized object can be created, representing only specific parts of the manuscript. With this, I'm handing over to Carolin, who is presenting a second case study based on her doctoral thesis, which she will start in October 2020 in Oxford.
Thank you, Luise. As a second case study, I would like to present my work on the Medingen manuscript, now the subject of my dissertation. Back in 2017, I met Henrike Lehnemann, who passed on her enthusiasm for the manuscripts from the former Cistercian nunnery of Medingen, near Lüneburg, to many of her students. It was above all the nuns' creative approach to the materiality of their private prayer books that captured my interest. A remarkable example of is the small format Bartholomew devotional book written by Barbara Wischkuhle, now held in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. On folio 46, the nun turned a hole in the parchment leaf into a peephole, which offered the view on the image of the martyrdom of St. Bartholomew on the previous page. However, what stood in the way of my research back then was the fact that a large part of the manuscripts had not been digitized until recently. At present, the Medingen Manuscript corpus is spread over 17 collections on 2 continents. Moreover, the limited accessibility in the past explains why mainly special studies on individual objects were published, with a tendency to generalize the results to the entire corpus afterwards. In the Medingen case, this approach had severe consequences. As a result of Gerhard Achten's investigation of the watermarks of selected paper manuscripts, the production of the entire corpus was limited to the years between 1470 and 1520, and equated by Regina Zermann with the upswing of the sculptorium under the Reform Provost Thielemann of Babenstedt. Subsequently, the Medingen manuscripts were declared to be a product of the North German Reform movement. To refine this narrative, a comparison of currently known manuscripts of the corpus was needed. The increase in digitalization in recent years, for which the Polonsky Foundation project Manuscripts from German-speaking lands is a brilliant example, has played into my cards. With the digitized object at hand, I made a table for each prayer book which summarized my research findings. You can see an example of my work here on the slide. At present, the tables have more than 200 pages. Nevertheless, the effort was worth it. Mainly based on stylistic considerations, I succeeded in dividing the body into 2 distinct layers. At the present state, 5 manuscripts and 2 fragments were written before the monastic reform took place in the Medingen convent. However, still the majority of the manuscripts were clearly written afterwards. Comparing manuscripts from the 2 production layers makes apparent that the nuns, especially in the prayer books produced after the monastery reform in 1479, deliberately put the aspect of materiality in the service of a revived devotional practice. in the letters Lüne in veils, thick gold initials, as well as colorful marginal illuminations and elegant penwork initials, to name but a few examples, enable the reader to experience the prayers with all outer senses. These features can be to some extent examined in digital reproductions. Currently, I'm looking into the Lüne in veils and later Medingen prayer books. This investigation focuses mainly on codicological and devotional aspects. In many examples, as in the Oxford Psalter MS Don E248, the ones Lüne in veils are no longer, but remains a tiny perforation, often hard to see against the splendor used for the visible praise of God. It is therefore particularly helpful that the high-resolution digital reproductions allow the viewer to zoom in on the remaining material traces. To sum this up, the encounter with the physical object provides additional information one cannot solely derive from the manuscript's digital reproduction, especially concerning the Lüne in veils. The physical object allows the reader to lift the veil himself, and thus to comprehend the revelation of the Word of God in the prayer book itself. A broader understanding of devotional practices is what pays out for the many hours spent in the Bodleian before the originals. Nevertheless, without the high-resolution images, it is difficult for the human eye to fully comprehend the extraordinary materiality which the nuns left behind. Only in taking insights from the digitized manuscripts and applying it to the physical object, one can gain a holistic understanding of the devotional practices at work. With this, we are coming to the last phenomenon we want to illuminate in our talk, and I'm handing over to Lena, who is a postdoc in a binational additional project in Oxford.
Thank you, Carolin. Well, as we have seen, when digitizing manuscripts, not only the reproduction of the written text is important, it is, or should be, scholarly standard that size, colors, the binding, and specific material features are reproduced. But what about the parts of a manuscript that offer nothing spectacular to see? What about empty pages? Is it not mandatory to include them in digital representations and digital editions? But how is this to be done, and what is to be considered? I have considered this question from two perspectives. As a user of digital reproductions of manuscripts and as an editor in a team that is currently working on a digital edition of these manuscripts. These are the three letterbooks from the Benedictine convent Lüne in northern Germany, in which the nuns copied a large part of their correspondence between 1460 and 1550. The manuscripts contain more than 1,800 texts in total. As a user, I examined the manuscripts for their function for the convent's social community. Here, the digitized representation had the advantage that I could read independently of time and location, annotate the photos, change contrast and brightness, or simply that I could zoom in and zoom out. Thus, understanding of the text was without problem, as was the examination of the different hands that wrote the letter texts. But the process of creation I could not reconstruct. Only the examination of the physical objects showed that the empty pages contained the decisive clue. Although they were included in the digitized reproduction, I had not been able to interpret them. Why are they where they are? The answer was as simple as spectacular. The empty pages turned out to be usually a middle sheet or cover sheet of a quire. This becomes clear especially in the smallest and thickest of the three manuscripts, manuscript 15. The 33 quires and their sheets must have been inscribed simultaneously by a group of nuns working in parallel. Meanwhile, the quires must have been lying open in air and light before they were gathered for the binding. Then, many quires were wrapped or filled in the middle by another one or two double sheets. This is indicated by the darkened color and dirt that regularly occurs much stronger on folio 2 recto than on folio 1 recto, an indication that also was only visible in the physical object. It is quite clear that the nuns, when compiling the sheets to quires and the quires to a book, found that a little more space was needed to, for example, copy the last text in a quire in full. Thus, they have wrapped the quire in another 1 or 2 double sheets, so that 2 or 4 blank pages were placed at the beginning of the quire. The nuns did not cut these sheets out, but left and partly filled them with supplements. So what in the manuscript digitized representation looked like an arbitrary scattering of empty pages, one could have mistaken them as a planned space for expected supplements at this exact position, turned out to be systematic traces of a cooperative and step-by-step production process. Of course, this knowledge is highly important for our team. In our edition, we represent the transcribed text side by side with the digital reproduction, which can be opened both in a reading or a diplomatic version. The digital edition includes links to background information or references to other parts of the manuscript. However, we are still discussing how to deal with the empty pages. How can the hidden material information best be represented? How can matching empty sheets, dirt, or parts of cut watermarks made visible? In any case, these marks are not visible on our brightly illuminated photos taken from above. It would take several photos each in the backlight and in very special angles just to capture an impression of the actual materiality. It seems, therefore, that information from empty pages of a manuscript can still best be described in a linear text, as in printed editions. Although the possibilities of digital edition dispel the need for a linear representation of manuscripts, texts, and research results, they are still limited when it comes to standards for the inclusion of the material characteristics. To solve this, there is much more close exchange needed between those who produce digital reproductions and those who use them.
Thank you, Lena. To conclude, as the 4 case studies here have shown, the 2D and the 3D versions offer insights which may be exclusive to them. The remnants of veils and their materiality is best studied in the physical object, whereas the stylistic development of the Henflin workshop can be best spotted from a bird's eye view in the digitized object. Stylus glosses and empty pages can be digitized, but this requires different conditions to those usually applied in digitisation and the discussion of scientific standards. A blended approach, meaning a back and forth between physical and digital, is the most fruitful, as only the synthesis of the different sets of information gained from both objects provide us with a more complete set of data. In studying the digitized object as an object in its own right and reapplying the specific insights gained to the physical object, we want to be part of the most exciting trends of current research in medieval studies and beyond.